Recently, I was invited to be on Modern Day Debate at the invitation of a Dr. Chris Thompson, a professional neuroscientist who wanted me to be his partner in a debate against a pair of creationists, one of whom had a relevant PhD and does laboratory work in biology. I didn't know who that creationist biologist was, but I knew of his partner. It was someone who posted demonstrably factually false claims on YouTube while pretending to be a truth seeker. Yet she said it was a colossal waste of time to hear me point out any of the many things she got wrong. She certainly wasn't going to admit or correct any of those many errors, not even one of them, no matter how soundly disproved. So I was looking forward to exposing them publicly. But she dropped out by about the time that I signed on, and I was stuck with the other guy, Sal Cordova. He made a video looking for a new debate partner wherein he said that this would be a rematch between him and I. It seems that I had talked to him once before, but I didn't remember. He said he wanted this debate to be one-on-one with me. He was upset that there was a partner involved, but I wasn't even part of the original lineup. It was originally between him and Chris Thompson, who did a brilliant job, by the way. Now, there's not that many scientists who can also convey their knowledge effectively in a debate format, but Chris Thompson can, and he did, and I was happy that he wanted me on his team. The partner that Sal eventually found was Cindy Lincoln, formerly known as one of Kent Hovind's wives. And for that reason, I felt sympathetic to her plight, having come out of a cult situation where she's never had a chance or a clue. Imagine being lied to about everything for your whole life and never knowing any better and making those lies your identity. Very stifling and sad. Now, as I predicted in my opening statement, neither she nor Sal Cordova, neither one of them even knew what evolution is. And consequently, both of them had to ignore evolution entirely to argue against the origin of life instead, on the classic God of the Gaps fallacy, assuming that whatever is not yet well explained by science somehow becomes evidence for God. Not understanding what evidence is either, because every debate with creationists is always that way. And it's fun to point out what these words actually mean and see the little light come on in their eyes. For example, here's my favorite part of that debate.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I still want to know, I mean, did Noah have every species of dog and every species of bovid and all of that on his ark, or did he have like archetypes and then you have other species evolve from that archetype?
I think I like your answer, Aaron. You thought
Aron.
I'm very sorry.
Need a cattle prod, Aron.
It's just that I thought of that name. I'm so sorry. I'm not trying to.
No worries. But so you accept? Do you accept that, or do you believe that Noah had every species that exists today?
No.
Or did he have archetypes which then evolved into the different species we have today?
I believe, can't prove, but I think when you were in the debate with Charles Jackson and he pointed out the wolf-like ancestry, I agree with that.
Okay, so you accept evolution happens.
Not from a single cell.
Change. I accept that definition of change happens.
So you accept macroevolution by definition, the emergence of new species at or above the species level, including the genus level and sometimes even the family level, according to Kent Hovind.
I never thought of it.
Prepare.
Okay, so you accept
because I don't like the definition.
Not just a belief.
I'll tell you why.
Okay, but you accept that evolution happens and that it's not just a belief.
I accept that. I accept that some evolution happens, but it doesn't explain all the features of life.
We can go back past to the formation of life, back to the formation of the properties that you want to argue for, but we're talking about evolution today. That's the purpose of the debate. So I just want to get a concession. You accept that evolution happened. So now let's talk about the creationist argument on Noah's Ark. If he didn't have all of the different species, then he had archetypes for the beginnings of the different species. And the creationist argument is that all of taxonomy is correct, but only at the surface. And then they want to cut off some little roots for archetypes. If you're going to make an argument that there was a creator, and then you have to come up with the origins of these archetypes. You can't avoid that. The only thing you've come up with so far is that God made cells, but that means that everything from the cell on evolved. If you want to talk about evolution, or if you want to say that there is no evolution, then you have to show where the creation began. Well, you can't say there's no evolution. You have to accept that the evolution was at some point. Evolution is a given. We both accept that evolution happens, but you're going to contest that God made some of these and some of these. Well, some of what? Where is the point that he created things?
That's a very good question. And my answer is I gave examples: nuclear localization signals, chromatin.
Cells. So cell formation.
No, cell parts.
God created
specific
cells,
cell parts. Specific
and everything
cell
after
parts.
that evolved.
And I gave probabilistic reasons why it had to be there, because it's going to be dead if it's not there.
All.
I'm sorry.
Did Noah have a bunch of cells on his ark, or did he have different types of animals that were created by your God?
I don't know, and I don't think I need to answer it to believe that God.
I knew you didn't think you would answer. Remember when I said so many times that this is the creationist argument they have to answer, but will not?
So Sal's argument, seriously, was that if there is some aspect of the origin or early evolution of life that is not yet well understood, well, then we can just pretend as if we don't understand anything and throw out everything that we can prove that we really do know as if we didn't know anything at all. And the creationist never has to explain anything, and creationism has never explained anything. It's always, I don't know, therefore magic. They don't even have to show that magic, miracles, are even real. That's just their default assumption. It's rare to hear arguments that bad from someone with a doctorate and who is working as a scientist. Now, the point of this video, the one I'm making now, is not so much a debate review as it is to make a point. And creationists generally don't like getting into written discussions where they have to provide citations and where we get to read them before responding intelligently after we've seen that, no, that quote doesn't really say or imply what you said it did. Creationists will not subject themselves to that in any venue where they will be held accountable and lose reputation for making false or stupid claims. Because for them, it's not about the facts, the truth of the matter. It's about their feelings. So they would rather debate live, where they can pretend as if they have...
I have so much evidence
that they don't really have, and don't have to show live on the fly. So whenever we have debates like this, where either party makes claims about genetics or about radiometric dating, they should be fact-checked by professional geneticists or physicists or whatever specialist is appropriate to whatever claim. In another debate I had with creationist Dr. Charles Jackson, I asked him whether he could cite any actual fact which both sides could show to be true, and which also qualifies as evidence in the sense that it actually indicates or gives substance to the otherwise erroneous and wholly unsupported assumptions of creationism. Jackson cited something, I don't remember what it was, but I couldn't check it on the fly while the debate was going on. So after it was over, I contacted Dr. Daniel Stern Cardinale, who, not surprisingly, thoroughly refuted Jackson's claim. And similarly, I've asked Dr. Jonathan Baker to help fact-check apologists too, because he actually does radiometric dating, and he knows all the falsehoods that creationists habitually spread about that. Because in every such debate, whatever fact the creationist claims is either not really a fact, meaning that it's not actually observed nor verifiable, or if it is, then it's misrepresented and misunderstood, because when you read the original claim, you find it doesn't really support their position at all, that they missed something terribly important in there. So in this debate, I asked the same question of Sal Cordova. I asked whether both of these scientists would chime in as my Snopes to confirm whether a creationist has ever had a valid argument or not. And here are a few clips. Observe and enjoy.
As I said, I published in Population Genetics with Dr. Sanford. It's in university shelves in a book on mathematics and the arts and sciences. And the human genome is decaying. There are many titles that are saying, like by evolutionists that say, why haven't we died 100 times over? That to me just screams that, humanity's young. And this does have medical implications and will lead to testable predictions about the direction of civilization and how long we're going to stay on Earth. And to me, that's just very sobering. And I'm just throwing it out there. And I don't know any major geneticist that thinks our genome is actually improving. Have you studied population genetics? Have you published in it?
No, I have not published.
Okay, I have. And you're talking about not studying things. I've studied under top evolutionary biologists. I've published in population genetics. There are problems. It's not as good as you characterized. First of all, their definition of fitness is now known to be flawed. Natural selection tends to reduce versatility. Yes.
So
When
subjective.
Yes.
did I ever bring up a definition of fitness?
Well, you're just talking about population genetics. It comes up. That's a field in
So-
population genetics. If you're going to bring the topic up,
What is my
but
definition of
we were
fitness?
talking about faith here.
The definition of fitness in evolutionary biology is reproductive output, period. It's about whose alleles are going to be best represented in future generations. There are different ways to measure that, and some work better than others depending on the specific context, the specific species you're dealing with. But Sal wants to redefine fitness to mean something along the lines of complexity. He doesn't have a specific definition for it, and Sal and I have actually talked about this directly. He doesn't have a specific definition for what he thinks fitness should mean, but it's something related to complexity. And the point is that you change the definition of fitness and then you argue that fitness cannot increase. The trick here is a bait and switch with the meaning of fitness that's related to genetic entropy. You change the definition to be something related to complexity and then rely on run-of-the-mill, really old, tired creationist arguments that complexity, in some form, cannot evolve. And to be clear, these arguments are nonsense. I'm going to talk about one of them in just a few minutes, but creationists still use them. So you lean on these complexity cannot evolve arguments, and then by changing the definition of fitness, you then apply those arguments to evolution in general. It's a bait and switch. That's what's going on here.
You said that we ignored taxonomy.
Mm-hmm.
That's partly because cell stuff takes priority. I just showed stuff with a chromatin double-stranded break repair. How does that evolve? How does the dinosaur and fossil record explain that? That's what I'm saying. That's what we are saying are faith statements. You can't just use circularly reasoned phylogenetic methods to try to explain probabilistic problems here, because we could walk through that. We could go through the cell membrane. Dr. Chris probably teaches about chromatin and the cell membrane, nuclear import-export. How did that evolve? How does the fossil record explain that? How can you explain it in terms of phylogeny without resort to circular reasoning? These are faith statements. You cannot, these are non sequiturs to go from the fossil record to be asking all these questions about young earth creationism.
So you're the one using
it still doesn't solve it. It is a faith statement. It is not reasonable. Thank you.
You're accusing me of using a definition I never used. I never even brought up the definition. You asked me how dinosaurs explain things that evolved before dinosaurs. So you're conflating, you're doing a whole lot of non sequiturs here. Why don't we just look at the taxonomy of any specific thing, right? Start with dinosaurs if you want. Start with dogs if you want.
I told you why. I told you why. Cells take precedence over fossils.
I gave you the challenge that you, sir, cannot answer and must. If there was any
I don't have to answer it.
And we know that there is no truth to creationism. There is truth to evolution. There's things we can demonstrate to be true about evolution. There is nothing that you... What?
Protein families.
What?
The tree, you're talking about phylogenetic trees, but the tree that he grew up of the cells was...
I don't have to
really
prove
good.
anything that you ask, because the problem with cell transitions makes it moot. This is a big deal. This is exactly the problem with the bent pencil. If you want to cherry pick, if you want to ignore anomalous problems, you can, and you can get a nice looking theory. I've given the single ugly fact that breaks a beautiful hypothesis. That is the eukaryotic components, the emergence of them from simpler forms, and also proteins that just don't have common ancestors. They'd have to come from nothing.
Put that up, Sal.
No, they
Put
don't.
up that
You are
tree.
conflating a bunch of different non sequiturs while accusing me of the very thing that you're doing. If you want to argue for creationism, then you are the one who's ignoring everything. I gave you the thing that you must address. If you want to show that taxonomy is only good up to a certain point, you got to show me where that point is.
He did. He showed
No, he
you a
didn't.
tree.
He doesn't even know what the question means.
He showed you a taxonomic tree.
I ignored it, yes, because it is moot.
You're really good.
I have everything I put forward dwarfs your issues. This is a bigger problem.
It doesn't, Sal. You have to come up with a mechanism to explain.
Eukaryotic transition. If you don't have eukaryotic evolution, you don't have evolution. I showed you the problems. If you want to
have evolution
and pretend it doesn't exist as a problem, that's your choice. I'm not the one pretending.
This is what R.J. Downard calls the origins or bust strategy. It's when creationists realize they don't have a leg to stand on when disputing this or that specific evolutionary event, so the supposed problems for evolution keep getting pushed further and further back into the past. So you might be talking about like human-chimp common ancestry, for example, but that gets pushed back to the origins of animals or the origins of eukaryotes, and eventually all the way back to abiogenesis, the origins of cellular life. When creationists do this, they're moving the goalposts because they have to concede the point at hand. So let's point this out directly. They've lost on one topic, so they're changing the topic to a new one.
Can I share my screen,
Sure.
Please? This is a topoisomerase enzyme. It is homodimeric. I published on this enzyme. We estimate 60 some interface points to make this. This is difficult. I ask evolutionists how this evolved. They just give me these circularly reasoned phylogenetic explanations. It has nothing to do with taxonomy, but we would be dead without this. It also has to have reformatting and the nuclear localizations and a lot of other things in the prokaryote to eukaryote transition. There are other things with proteins that people seem to not ignore. That's one of my co-authors, published in Nature. And we'll skip this. We can talk about topoisomerases. This is the phylogeny. It's a mess. And I have 1 minute to go. One of the problems in protein architecture is the fit. There needs to be proper charge distributions and shaping so we can get these induced fits. Delving into taxonomy doesn't solve this. I ask evolutionists all the time, how does this evolve? They say, we don't know. We have just a phylogenetic thing. It's a faith statement. And to say that somehow you look at the fossil record and you can claim these things, these complex systems like this, like the EZH2 can evolve, that's a non sequitur. And until you can answer that,
Sal's good, yeah.
you have a faith statement. That is not science. Thank you.
Okay. I appreciate your passion for the Sal. I am not an expert in topoisomerase for sure. However, I did a little bit of looking into topoisomerase. I'd like to share my screen if I could. 1 second here.
I also have to add that if we say that we don't know something, that's not a faith statement. Not having the answer, but saying that you do have the answer, that's the definition of a faith statement. So Sal saying that he knows that was a god, or that he has reason to believe that that's a god, that's a faith statement. That's not what we're doing. I asked him a question he refuses to answer, so he needs to change the subject.
This is just the concept of irreducible complexity without saying those exact words. Sal said to me directly that he doesn't like to use the term irreducible complexity, but that's the form of the argument he's making here. The short version of irreducible complexity is that if you have a system that requires a number of specific parts to work, like a biochemical pathway or an interaction between two proteins, and you remove any one of those parts, the system stops working, and that means it couldn't have evolved. That's the short version for irreducible complexity. Well, the problem here is that we've directly observed these types of systems evolve. We've directly seen systems evolve that meet the criteria for irreducible complexity. In the debate, Sal showed a figure as an example of such a system, a protein with a bunch of interactions holding two components together. But that's exactly the kind of thing that evolved in an HIV protein called VPU just within the last century. We've directly observed the evolution of systems that invalidate this argument.
I have gone from being a theistic evolutionist to an old Earth creationist to a young Earth creationist. Some of the stuff in physics has started to make me think, and enough that it put enough doubt that I said, just given kind of my own, because I'm a Christian and I have, I read the Bible. It's like, okay, it seems enough of it aligns with the way that I see the scientific evidence. Just as a matter of faith, I said, I'll accept it by faith. I'm not going to pretend I have the science, but there have been certain things with radiometric dating that have only emerged like in the last year with heavy electron quasi-particles, there may be a pathway to changing nuclear structure, and that could throw everything, a monkey wrench in everything. And, you know, my graduate degree is in applied physics, and I was very fascinated by this topic. And I think it's still kind of early in the game to kind of write young Earth creationism off. As I've studied the evidence, more and more aligns with the Bible. I've seen a trend over 40 years as I've watched the creation evolution controversy. And as I've watched it develop, the trend has been favorable more toward the young Earth view.
I am curious, in what way has the trend been more favorable to the young Earth view? I mean, I'll give Sal the benefit of the doubt in that geology is not his field, but let's be real, none of the creationist organizations are conducting hypothesis-driven research. And none of them are even trying to influence fellow Earth scientists. I mean, all of their efforts are directed at those who don't know how to critically examine their claims. And that's not the signature of a scientific revolution, slowly revealing the truth. Consider, for example, that so-called flood geologists still disagree with each other wildly about which rocks were deposited during the flood and which rocks were deposited since the flood. I mean, some say that that boundary is at the end of the Cretaceous, and others say it was much later or much earlier in the geologic column. I mean, really? If the evidence for a recent global flood is so obvious, why can't you tell us where it begins and ends? I mean, well, it's not because the evidence is ambiguous, but rather because all options are equally absurd. Even Holocene sediments could not feasibly have been deposited within the last 5,000 years alone. They unambiguously span more than 11,000 years of Earth history.
I have now started to study heavy electron quasi-particles. I think radiometric dating could be flawed, and I'm excited about where this could go in the next 10, 20 years.
We are still learning about the fundamental forces and particles that govern the universe, and that research is bound to change our understanding. But to judge that modern experiments could throw a monkey wrench into something like radiometric dating, that seems not only premature, but it's also a misguided attempt to cast unreasonable doubt on a well-established theory. I mean, Sal is presumably referring to particles like muons, which behave similar to electrons but have much greater mass, and he claims there may be a process that modifies nuclear structure but isn't accounted for by radioactive decay equation. For the sake of discussion, let's assume that is the case. And first, by all means, look into it, and if you find that it undermines radiometric techniques beyond the stated error bars, we'll publish those findings so that we can collectively improve our methods. But until then, it's not helpful to hypothesize contrary to fact. Either way, there is no reason at present to abandon our confidence in radiometric dating. Whatever process he thinks could compromise the results, it's not a commonly occurring one. I mean, long-term monitoring of radioactive materials has only yielded elegant formulas that don't hint at any sizable monkey wrenches in the system, and certainly none that could alter the results by 7 orders of magnitude. Above all, the best validation of radiometric dating is internal consistency. If you want to contend seriously that radiometric dating doesn't work, you have to explain why it already works so well. I mean, how could we ever get the same results from the radiocarbon system as we do from the uranium series, or from 2 completely different minerals within the same rock? And why do ages get systematically older deeper in the rock record? And finally, how is it the radiometric dates can be corroborated by methods that don't even depend on radioactivity, like historical archives or dendrochronology or amino acid racemization or laminate counts? I mean, Sal is asking us to forsake 1,000 lines of evidence in favor of one speculation.
So I can show actual facts that are positively indicative of evolution and exclusively concordant with evolution and that contradict creationism. Can you show any actual fact that we both accept is an actual fact, something that we can both verify to be true, that is also indicative of the creationist position?
I'd like to say, Aron, that you have stated repeatedly that those things are true.
What things are true?
Evolution is demonstrable and that creation is falsified.
Do you not accept that?
You have not shown either.
You do accept. Well, Sal accepts that all the canids are related by evolution, right? Whether you
that doesn't mean the canids are related to the plants.
I'll give you I'll give you 2 testable predictions.
Before you do that, I just want to give you all a 2-minute heads up, and then we've got to go to the Q&A.
Okay.
2 testable predictions. The human genome is going to continue to deteriorate. We won't last long as a species. Also, the geomagnetic field, you can actually look it up at Wikipedia. It's predicted to be gone in 1600 years. That would be suggestive that it hasn't been around that long. Civilization will end.
All right, let's look it up on Wikipedia. I found the quote he was referring to. It says, "The direction and intensity of the dipole change over time. Over the last 2 centuries, the dipole strength has been decreasing at a rate of about 6.3% per century. At this rate of decrease, the field would be negligible in about 1600 years. However, this strength is about average for the last 7,000 years, and the current rate of change is not unusual." Now, this reference in Wikipedia for the estimate of 1600 years is itself a glossary entry from the Canadian Geological Society, not a research article. Regardless, this figure was never meant to be a scientific forecast of future geomagnetic field strength. It merely provides a perspective on the rate of recent secular variation. Instead, Sal is asking us to test whether the air temperature in Denver will be minus 100 next summer based on the rate of cooling since July. Do you see the error? This extrapolation is flawed because geomagnetic field strength is variable through time, sometimes increasing and sometimes decaying. We know that prior to the 1800s, the trend was opposite to today, not from direct observations, but proxy records of magnetism, such as in dated pottery, soil, sediments, and cosmogenic isotopes. The modern dipole moment and its variation are both within the range of natural variability for the Holocene, as you can see here, as well as for the last 100,000 years. But hey, what if Sal's prediction is right and the field strength does become negligible in 1600 years? Does that mean the Earth is young? No, not at all, because the field has decayed to almost nothing many times in the past, most recently during the Lechamp excursion about 41 to 42,000 years ago. This event has been known since the late 80s, but new high-resolution records keep popping up, and it's really quite fascinating. Now, the modern field variation does not appear to be analogous to past magnetic excursions or reversals, but even if that did happen, it doesn't mean the magnetic field would be gone, never to return. And the physics behind the magnetic field states, the dynamo model, as it's called, are understood well enough to make decently robust 5-year forecasts of magnetic field anomalies, as you can see here. So where does Sal's argument come from? I mean, it originates with Thomas Barnes, who first cited field decay as evidence for the young Earth, but he did so back in 1971, before we had long-term reconstructions of the geomagnetic field, so let's give him a pass. But in the early 1990s, Russell Humphreys revived it, despite that it was already falsified by known observations. He contended that Earth's magnetic field began in a very strong state, decayed, then fluctuated wildly during the flood, and then decayed steadily over the last 2 millennia. In other words, it's not something that could be stable over billions of years. Humphreys also speculated that the initial state of Earth's magnetic field could be estimated by assuming that Earth was made entirely of water molecules all properly aligned to generate a dipole. He referenced the waters in Genesis 1:2 to support this. I mean, I say he speculated because it's nothing we could ever test or reconstruct quantitatively. So the common theme among creationists has always been to reject that Earth's magnetic field operates as a dynamo with a dynamic magnetic moment, despite that the concept has reached scientific consensus among geophysicists. Young Earth creationists also have to reject, however, all of this paleomagnetic data used to reconstruct field strength, including that from archaeology, because it flatly contradicts their own, honestly, hilariously arbitrary reconstruction. So take a look at this figure from Russell Humphreys, his book in 1993 called The Earth's Magnetic Field is Young. It's a totally meaningless figure. I mean, how many reversals in field strength were there? How large were they? What caused them? What's the scale on the y-axis here? Is it linear or logarithmic? I mean, nobody has a clue. He just drew some squiggly lines and told people it must be young because, trust me, I'm a doctor. I mean, the idea here is that it can't decay forever. It couldn't have been infinitely strong in the past, and therefore the Earth is young. But look, his own graph shows a dynamic behavior of the dipole moment, these reversals during the flood. He has to be able to explain how we get magnetic reversals recorded in the rocks. So even if Humphreys is right, he must be wrong. I mean, by their own model, current decay of the magnetic field tells us nothing about the age of the Earth.
And one last thing is we usually do a topic or a poll topic of subtopics that we ask the audience, what do you most want to see the audience, or I should say the guests, discuss before we wrap up? The number one thing was transitional fossils. So we're going to jump back into the Q&A, but I do want to give a chance, because I forgot to do this before the Q&A, is transitional fossils. Any thoughts? Maybe we take 5 minutes just to talk about this really quick, because we do want to honor this subtopic selection poll from the audience. Transitional fossils, thoughts in about 5 minutes.
Creationists are divided on this. I argue vigorously there are transitional fossils in the sense of architectures, just like you can say transitions in cars. But what you can't have is transitional protein parts in the major families. I demonstrated that rather forcefully tonight. And by the way, other evolutionary biologists will back me on that, surprisingly.
This is related to the argument that if proteins do not all share universal common ancestry, then that's evidence for separate creation. The problem is that no biologists think that all proteins share common ancestry. Why not? Because de novo gene evolution is a thing, right? You can evolve new genes and new protein families without having to use modified forms of existing proteins. This is a well-documented process. We've identified de novo genes in fish, in plants, in humans, and other mammals. It's a very common process. So his argument is that proteins should basically look like fossils or genetics, with transitional forms between groups showing a clear picture of universal common ancestry. But that's not how protein evolution works. De novo genes are real, so you don't get a single evolutionary tree. You could identify protein families that share common ancestry going back hundreds of millions, if not billions of years, but you're never going to find that one universal common ancestor for proteins, because it doesn't exist. And that's okay. I'll also note that this argument is an admission of the validity of the genetic evidence for universal common ancestry. If proteins lack such evidence, we can only make that determination in contrast to DNA sequences, which very clearly indicates common descent. So whenever a creationist makes this argument about proteins not all sharing common ancestries, make sure you thank them for accepting the genetic evidence for universal common ancestry.
Once again, we see that of Sal's two cited facts, one of them is not a fact, being as it was not actually observed, and the other is misunderstood, irrelevant, and not indicative. So still, to date, no evidence exists for creationism.